At 82 years old, Jessi Colter has carried a secret that has haunted her for decades, one tied not just to her marriage, but to the very soul of country music itself. She was the woman who stood beside Waylon Jennings during the Outlaw Movement, the wife who endured the chaos of his addictions, the highs of his fame, and the crushing lows of his darkest days. For years, she protected his memory, guarding both his music and his reputation with fierce loyalty. But time has a way of loosening the grip of silence, and now Jessi has decided to share something she once swore she would take to her grave. A truth so heavy, it reshapes the way fans remember Waylon. This is not just another story about late-night parties or outlaw rebellion. This is a revelation that cuts deeper. One that Waylon tried to bury in shadows, and one that Jessi has finally brought into the light. The story of Waylon Jennings is about to change forever. Waylon Jennings did not want to be just another country singer lost in the assembly line of Nashville's polished machine. He was born in Littlefield, Texas, a restless boy with a guitar and a hunger that went far beyond the cotton fields. From the very beginning, he was different. He carried a voice that wasn't meant to be confined by rules, a spirit that rebelled against authority, and a heart that only beat to its own rhythm. By the time he was a teenager, he was already working as a DJ, spinning records and dreaming of making his own. His life would change forever when Buddy Holly took him under his wing, hiring him to play bass and showing him what the road really looked like. Waylon was supposed to be on the plane that crashed in 1959, the one that killed Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper. But at the last moment, fate kept him grounded, leaving him with a survivor's guilt that never truly left. That night, as the world lost one of its brightest stars, Waylon felt the weight of destiny settle on his shoulders. He wasn't just spared, he was chosen for something, and that something would shake country music to its core. In the 1970s, Waylon joined forces with Willie Nelson, Chris Christopherson, and Johnny Cash in what would be called the Highwaymen. But before that, he had already sparked a revolution. He refused to let record executives dictate how he recorded, demanding creative control when everyone else bowed their heads. The industry didn't want outlaws, but Waylon became one anyway. With his album Honky Tonk Heroes in 1973, he laid the groundwork for outlaw country, a sound that was raw, unapologetic, and soaked in whiskey and truth. He sang about real pain, real sin, and the endless road that swallowed men whole. He was the king of the outlaws, standing tall with his boots planted firmly in rebellion. And by his side, often in the shadows but never far away, was Jessi Colter. Unlike other women in the business, Jessi was no ordinary partner. She was a singer in her own right, with a hit of her own, "I'm Not Lisa," that carved her name into country music history. But she was also the anchor in Waylon's storm, the one person who saw both the legend the world admired and the broken man behind closed doors. While fans cheered for the outlaw king who could command arenas with a growl of his voice and a strike of his guitar, Jessi knew that his crown was heavy, and his kingdom was built on shaky ground. The world saw Waylon Jennings as a fearless icon, but Jessi saw the truth, the cracks, the shadows, the darkness he tried to hide even as his star burned brighter than ever. When Waylon Jennings and Jessi Colter came together, it wasn't just a marriage, it was a storm colliding with a flame, a union that could either burn down everything around it or light up the darkest skies. Jessi, born Miriam Johnson in Phoenix, Arizona, had a voice that dripped with sorrow and strength, a sound that made listeners feel like they were peering straight into her soul. She was raised in a religious home, and for a time she thought her destiny might be tied to the church. But music pulled her away. By the time she met Waylon, she was already marked by both resilience and fragility, the perfect mix to endure what life with him would demand. Their love story began in 1969, and for Jessi, it was like stepping into a whirlwind. Waylon was magnetic, unpredictable, and dangerous all at once. He carried the charm of a man who could own any room, but he also carried demons that followed him everywhere. Cocaine, pills, alcohol. Waylon indulged in them all, and his lifestyle was as reckless as his music was powerful. Most women would have run from that chaos, but Jessi stayed, not out of naivety, but out of a belief that she could weather the storm and maybe even calm it. Together, they built a life that was both beautiful and brutal. There were nights of laughter and music, with guitars filling their home, and mornings when the weight of Waylon's choices nearly crushed them. Jessi watched as his addictions drained not just his health, but their finances, sometimes leaving them scrambling for stability, even while his songs topped the charts. There were fights so loud the neighbors would whisper about them, and reconciliations so tender it seemed as though love itself had stitched their wounds back together. Jessi gave birth to their son, Shooter Jennings, in 1979, and while motherhood softened some edges, it didn't erase the chaos. Shooter would later recall nights when the house felt like a war zone, when Waylon's paranoia and exhaustion left everyone walking on eggshells. Yet despite it all, Jessi stood firm. She sang with him, toured with him, and became not just his wife, but his partner in survival. Their duets, like Storms Never Last, were more than just songs. They were confessions. Messages to each other wrapped in melody, admissions that life had torn them apart, but love was the thread that kept them stitched together. Still, beneath the harmony, shadows lingered. Jessi knew that love couldn't always shield her from the truths Waylon carried deep inside. Secrets lived in his silences, in the moments when his eyes went dark and distant. She didn't know then that the secret he buried would one day resurface, and when it did, it would leave her with a choice: remain silent forever, or finally tell the world what Waylon never could. Waylon Jennings was the outlaw king on stage, but off stage, he was a man buckling under the weight of his own crown. Fame had given him the freedom he once fought for, yet it also chained him in ways he never expected. By the mid-1970s, Waylon was selling out arenas, topping the charts, and redefining country music with every record he made. To the outside world, it looked like a dream come true. But inside his dressing rooms, hotel suites, and dimly lit studios, the cost of that success was eating him alive. His cocaine habit became legendary, not just because of how much he consumed, but because of how normal it became for him. He once admitted to spending as much as $500 a day on the drug, a staggering number that bled him financially and physically. His weight fluctuated wildly. His moods shifted from manic energy to crushing despair. And his health teetered on collapse. Friends watched as his hands shook, his heart raced, and his temper flared without warning. Jessi saw it all up close, and while she loved him deeply, she couldn't deny the fear that haunted her every time he disappeared into another binge. Money, too, became a battlefield. Waylon's spending spiraled out of control. Private jets, endless parties, debts to dealers and creditors who didn't care that he was a superstar. At times, Jessi would quietly pay bills, sell belongings, or step in to keep their lives from crumbling under the financial strain. The outlaw image Waylon projected was real, but it came at a price that those closest to him paid with sleepless nights and broken trust. Behind closed doors, paranoia crept in. Waylon began to believe that everyone wanted something from him. Money, fame, favors, and trust became harder and harder to give. The isolation only fueled his darker impulses. And Jessi often found herself trying to hold together a man who was unraveling piece by piece. And yet, when he stepped onto a stage, the audience never saw the cracks. They saw the outlaw hero, the man who defied Nashville, the rebel who lived free and fearless. What they couldn't see was the cost of maintaining that image, the weight on his shoulders, and the torment that played out in whispers and shadows when the lights went down. Jessi carried the burden silently, watching the man she loved war with himself. She knew there was more to his pain than even the drugs and the debts. Something deeper, something hidden, something he never spoke of, but which revealed itself in moments when his eyes turned cold, when he retreated into silence, when he seemed haunted by a past she couldn't fully reach. The pressure of fame was crushing him, but Jessi was beginning to realize that fame alone wasn't the enemy. There was a secret buried in Waylon's soul, darker than cocaine, heavier than money, and far more dangerous than anything the world believed about him. And that secret was waiting to be revealed. For years, Jessi Colter believed she understood the man she had married. She knew his temper, his addictions, his reckless habits, and the way he could switch from tenderness to fury in a heartbeat. But there were moments when Waylon would grow silent, his eyes clouding over like storm clouds before a tornado. He would retreat into himself, pacing, strumming his guitar without sound, or staring into the distance as though replaying something only he could see. Jessi asked him what was wrong, but his answers were always vague, evasive, or laced with sarcasm. He would joke his way out of it, or bury himself in music, but she could sense it. Something heavier than cocaine, darker than fame, lingered in his mind. Friends saw glimpses of it too. Some said he carried a guilt that could not be named. Others whispered that Waylon had been involved in things no one would dare put into words. He had survived the plane crash that killed Buddy Holly, and though he never spoke of it in detail, Jessi knew the guilt gnawed at him like a wolf. In his worst moments, he confessed that he believed he should have died that night, that fate had cursed him by letting him live while his friend perished. But Jessi suspected it wasn't just survivor's guilt. There was something else, something Waylon never wanted anyone to know. On long nights, when the cocaine wore off and his defenses crumbled, Waylon would let pieces slip. He hinted at betrayals, at choices made in desperation, at dangerous men he had crossed during his wildest years. He spoke in riddles, never naming names, never telling the whole story, but enough to make Jessi's skin crawl. Once, he told her, if people knew the truth about me, they wouldn't sing along to my songs. They'd turn away. Jessi held onto those words like shards of glass, cutting her every time she replayed them. She began to see his addictions not just as habits, but as attempts to numb a pain he couldn't admit out loud. Every snort of cocaine, every night of excess, was his way of burying the truth deeper, drowning it so no one could drag it into the light. But secrets do not stay buried forever. They rise, like smoke under a locked door, until they choke the very air around you. Jessi knew that one day the truth would surface, whether Waylon wanted it to or not. And when it did, it would not just shatter the outlaw image, it would rewrite everything fans thought they knew about the man who embodied rebellion. She kept silent for decades, holding his confidence even after his death. But as she grew older, the weight of carrying that secret alone became unbearable. Waylon's darkest truth was clawing its way to the surface. And Jessi knew the time had come to finally reveal what her husband had spent a lifetime trying to hide. The breaking point didn't come in one explosive moment, but in a slow accumulation of cracks that Jessi could no longer patch over. Life with Waylon had always been unpredictable, swinging from joy to devastation with dizzying speed. But there came a night when Jessi realized the man she loved was not just fighting demons. He was hiding from something darker than either of them could control. It began with the silences. Waylon would vanish into himself, locking himself away in hotel rooms or back bedrooms, pacing in circles until the carpet wore thin beneath his boots. His music, once his salvation, began to sound like a burden. Jessi would hear him strumming chords with no melody, whispering lyrics that were never meant for public ears. Some nights, in his haze of cocaine and regret, he would say things that chilled her blood. He would mutter about people he owed, about choices he couldn't undo, about sins that even the outlaw image couldn't make romantic. At first, Jessi thought it was the drugs talking, paranoia running rampant through a tired mind. But then she saw it, the look in his eyes that told her these weren't hallucinations. These were memories, real, unshakable. One night, after a particularly violent fight, Waylon sat across from her at the kitchen table, his hands trembling, his voice barely more than a whisper. He told her he had done things that would tear apart the outlaw myth if anyone ever knew. Jessi pressed him, begged him to explain, but he shut down, burying his face in his hands. It was the closest he ever came to telling her everything, and it left her shaken. From then on, Jessi began piecing together fragments, whispers from friends who had been there during the worst of his binges, unsettling phone calls in the dead of night, mysterious debts that appeared and disappeared without explanation. There were times Jessi feared for their safety, moments when she looked over her shoulder, half expecting someone from Waylon's past to step out of the shadows and demand payment for a deal gone wrong. Love had always been her anchor, but love alone was no longer enough to protect her from the weight of Waylon's secrets. The breaking point came when Jessi realized that she was no longer just Waylon's wife. She was his keeper. The only person holding together a truth so volatile it could destroy his legacy. It wasn't just about the drugs, the fame, or even the guilt over Buddy Holly's crash. This was something else, something Waylon had buried so deeply that he couldn't speak it aloud without trembling. Jessi felt herself breaking under the strain, torn between the vows she had taken and the reality she was living in. She loved him with a devotion that defied logic, but she knew in her heart that the secret he carried was not just his anymore. It was hers too, and it was poisoning them both. That night, staring at the man who had become both her greatest love and her greatest burden, Jessi made a silent promise. One day, when the time was right, she would tell the truth. She would unmask the darkness he tried so hard to hide. She didn't know when, but she knew it was inevitable. Waylon's secret was too heavy for one soul to carry forever. When Jessi Colter finally spoke the words out loud, they carried the weight of 4 decades of silence. For years, fans had believed Waylon's darkest demons were no more than the drugs, the debts, and the outlaw lifestyle that he flaunted so openly. But Jessi revealed there was a deeper wound, a truth Waylon confessed to her in whispers during the loneliest nights of his life. It was survivor's guilt, yes, but not just the guilt of missing the Buddy Holly plane crash. Waylon believed that he had caused it. On that winter night in 1959, it was Waylon who gave up his seat on the doomed flight to JP. The big bopper Richardson, a man sick with the flu and desperate not to endure the freezing bus ride. Waylon thought he was doing a kindness, But when the news broke that the plane had gone down, killing everyone aboard, Waylon's soul was crushed. Buddy Holly, his friend and mentor, gone in an instant. And the last words Waylon had exchanged with him still echoed in his mind. Holly had joked, "I hope your old bus freezes up," to which Waylon, in a moment of dark humor, had replied, "Well, I hope your old plane crashes." Those words, meant as nothing more than banter between friends, became a curse that Waylon carried like a scar across his soul. He told Jessi that he never forgave himself, that he believed the crash was his fault. Not fate's, not the weather's, not the pilot's. His fault. To the world, this story was just a footnote in history, a coincidence recounted in interviews and biographies. But Jessi knew the depth of his torment. She revealed how, in private, Waylon would wake up drenched in sweat, haunted by Holly's voice, tormented by the image of that broken plane. He believed he had spoken death into existence, that his careless words had sealed the fate of 3 men. Jessi said that more than the cocaine, more than the pressure of fame, it was this secret guilt that consumed him, eating away at him in silence, while the world applauded his music. He never allowed himself to mourn fully, because mourning meant facing the words he wished he could take back. Jessi admitted that she spent years trying to convince him it wasn't his fault, that no man could change destiny with a sentence, but Waylon never believed her. To him, the outlaw life was penance, the music was confession, and the chaos was distraction. When Jessi revealed this truth, her voice trembled because she knew the world would see Waylon differently, not as just the fearless outlaw king, but as a man who believed himself cursed, a man who carried a private cross until the day he died. Waylon Jennings's darkest secret wasn't drugs or debts. It was the crushing belief that he had killed his best friend with nothing more than a careless line spoken in jest. And now, at 82, Jessi Colter finally let the world see the burden he could never shed. For decades, Jessi Colter carried the weight of Waylon's secret like a stone hidden beneath her heart. And it was not a burden she bore lightly. She knew the truth would change how the world saw him, and she refused to let that truth overshadow the man she loved. To the fans, Waylon was a rebel hero, the outlaw who fought Nashville's machine and won, the voice of a generation that wanted honesty instead of polish. But Jessi knew that beneath the bravado was a man who never forgave himself for words spoken in jest. His guilt over Buddy Holly's death was a ghost that followed them into every home they ever lived in, every tour bus, every recording studio. Jessi heard it in his silences, saw it in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, felt it in the way he clung to the drugs that dulled his pain. She kept his secret, because love demanded it. She had promised to protect him, not just as a wife, but as the only person who truly understood the storm inside him. She knew that if the world saw his guilt, they would call it weakness, or worse, mock it as superstition. Waylon was too proud, too strong to let anyone see him as fragile. And so Jessi protected him, absorbing his burden as though it were her own. She sang beside him, stood on stages that shook from his voice, and nodded politely when interviewers asked about the outlaw image, never hinting that the greatest rebellion Waylon ever fought was against his own conscience. Silence became her act of devotion, but it also became her prison. As the years passed and Waylon's health declined, diabetes stealing his strength, drugs robbing his vitality, Jessi felt the burden grow heavier. She watched him fade, still carrying the same guilt, still refusing to forgive himself, and she grieved not only for the man she loved, but for the peace he would never know. After his death in 2002, Jessi was left with the choice to let the secret die with him or to finally release it into the world. For nearly 2 decades, she chose silence, not because she was afraid, but because she wanted to protect his legacy. Fans deserved to remember Waylon as the Outlaw King, not as the broken man who believed his words had cursed Buddy Holly. But time does not ease all burdens. As Jessi grew older, she realized that keeping silent was also a betrayal, not of Waylon's image, but of his truth. The world knew the myth, only she knew the man, and the man was haunted. At 82, Jessi finally broke the silence, not to tarnish his name, but to give context to his chaos, to explain why the drugs and the excess were never just about pleasure. They were about punishment. She revealed the secret because she understood something Waylon never could: that no one blamed him, that he had carried guilt for a fate no human could control, and that maybe, by speaking it aloud, she could finally lift the burden that had crushed him. Silence had been her loyalty. Breaking that silence became her final act of love. The revelation of Waylon Jennings' darkest secret does not erase the music, nor does it strip away the power of his voice that thundered through arenas and bled out of radios across America. What it does, however, is change the way we understand the man behind the myth. For years, the outlaw image stood untouchable. The black leather vests, the growl in his voice, the defiance in every lyric. Fans saw him as fearless, larger than life, the man who refused to bow to Nashville's glossy demands. But thanks to Jessi Colter, we now know that fearlessness was born from a place of deep fear, that rebellion was fueled not just by defiance, but by guilt. His secret redefines his story, revealing that beneath every song, behind every sneer, lived a man who never stopped blaming himself for something he could not change. Survivor's guilt has crushed many men, but Waylon's was compounded by the cruel twist of fate, that his last words to Buddy Holly were words of jest that felt like a curse. He never forgave himself, and that guilt shaped his art, his addictions, and his very soul. Jessi's revelation reframes the chaos of his life. The cocaine binges that drained him weren't simply the excess of a rock star. They were his way of burying the voice that haunted him every night. The reckless spending, the constant need to rebel, the endless desire to drown in noise and motion, it was all a distraction, a desperate attempt to quiet a ghost. And Jessi bore witness to it all, holding her silence not to deceive the world, but to shield the man she loved from judgment. Now, at 82, she has finally given the world the missing piece of Waylon's puzzle. The Outlaw King wasn't simply rebelling against Nashville. He was rebelling against himself, against the cruel trick of fate that spared him while taking his friend. The revelation doesn't tarnish his legend. It deepens it. It reminds us that legends are not gods. They are men, and men are flawed. They carry burdens the world cannot see. Waylon's darkest secret proves that even those who seem invincible are often the most haunted. Fans may feel a sting of sorrow learning the truth, but in that sorrow lies a new kind of respect. To know that Waylon carried such a heavy cross and still gave the world music that shook the earth is to recognize his strength as much as his pain. His outlaw songs now sound different. They sound like confessions, like hymns from a sinner who believed himself unforgivable. They sound like a man trying to scream loud enough to drown the whisper of a curse he never escaped. And Jessi, faithful, loyal, unwavering Jessi, becomes more than just the woman who stood beside him. She becomes the keeper of his truth, the voice that finally set him free after his own voice was silenced by death. Her decision to reveal his secret was not an act of betrayal. It was an act of grace, a chance to show the world the full measure of the man she loved. She carried the burden of silence until it threatened to bury her, and by breaking it, she gave Waylon back to the world in his most human form. Not as an untouchable outlaw, but as a flawed man who lived with guilt, loved deeply, and sang his soul raw for all to hear. In the end, legends are not remembered for perfection. They are remembered for the truth they leave behind. And Waylon Jennings's truth is this: behind the outlaw, behind the rebel, behind the king, was a man haunted by a single moment in time, a man who believed his words had killed his friend, and a man who tried to atone for it until the day he died. Jessi Colter's voice trembles at 82, not because she fears tarnishing his memory, but because she knows the truth makes his legacy richer, more profound, and infinitely more human. Waylon Jennings will always be the outlaw king, but thanks to Jessi, we now see the man behind the crown, the man who carried a secret so heavy it nearly crushed him, and who left behind music powerful enough to outlive even his darkest shadows. And that is how legends are remembered, not for the myths that surround them, but for the truths that finally come to light.